This is Religious Studies 3300, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change. I'm the teacher, Andrew Smith, and we're recording this in a live stream classroom on February 9th, 2022. This is our fifth meeting of the semester already. How did that happen? It's happened so fast. Is that right? Doesn't seem like that can be possible. That we're already, is it the fourth meeting? No, I think it's the fifth meeting. Here we go. It's happening. It's happening. We had the second. It's all here. It's all happening so quickly. Anyway, if you were to read the March on Washington portion of the autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's easy to see the midsummer of 1963 as Martin Luther King Jr. at the peak of his powers and his popularity, as a triumph of the movement in ascent, the civil rights bill on the cusp of being passed, integration sweeping the cities of the South from Nashville to Birmingham. It's easy to see that the cause is winning in some regards at this point. There seems to be an infectious level of hope and optimism in this great iconic speech, the I Have a Dream speech, as delivered in Washington in August, and in the mood, even in reading Martin's synthesis of that. Of course, this is compiled by Dr. Clay Carson, but it still feels like, oh, this is where we're going. And I think I've always sort of, and I've been studying this text of 63 in the context of King more largely my whole life, but I became a serious MLK scholar in 11th grade, and I haven't quit. So I've been at this for 37 years or so, and I think I always kind of suppressed that this is not just the summer of the dream, but the nightmare continues. And at the end of that video, the contrast from the euphoria of Reverend Abernathy saying this is, the greatest day of his life, to the tragedy of 4 little girls in that church bombing in Birmingham. And a previous iteration of the class, we were able to take a field trip and sit in that very church building and feel it in the bones of the building and hear it in the voice of our tour guide. And we could go in the park across the street and see the statues of the children being attacked by dogs, and imagine that footage that is so iconic that I didn't show this evening of the fire hoses. I've started to believe that some of this kind of stuff is so traumatic. It's taken on a kind of protest pornography, if you will, and the trauma and the harm that continues to be done in our culture today in 2022 to young Black bodies. There was just a police shooting in Minneapolis last week, in the same town where George Floyd was murdered in 2020. And it was a no-knock warrant, something that was brought around about, to erode the rights of people in their homes and the protection against unreasonable search and seizure protected by our Constitution. And so I sat down this week and I really started to feel it was heavy on my heart that when I talked about 1963 tonight, that I would have to talk about the dream in the context of the nightmare and the problems that were going on. And as we see today with a civil rights bill that can't get passed. Next week is voting rights. Selma was so far integration. Now the Civil Rights Bill of 64 will happen. And then there's the Voting Rights Act in 65. It expired. And we'll see next week when we talk about Selma that in a sense, we're in a pre-60s moment. Here in 2022, who would have ever thought that we would be seeing the rollback of some of these brave and beautiful accomplishments that the movement succeeded at? So I'm going to walk us through some of the reasons why it is a dream that emerges in the context of a nightmare. And I'm going to provide a little bit of background and a little bit of backstory to the summer of 1963. We ended the last class listening to the speech, or a reading, I should say. It wasn't a speech. He spent his Easter holiday in jail in Birmingham, but he's given a reading of his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, and that's how we ended last week. And so this is the end of the Birmingham movement in May. There are many victories in May in the Birmingham movement. Some are seeing them as tentative victories, in part because there's so much violent backlash against the movement from segregationists and from racists in the South. So there's a lot of violence in retribution against the success of the movement. I didn't give a shout out, and I really like to give a shout out to all the minor and major players that were his companions in the movement. And I'm trying to include more names, even than was on that list of inspiration that I sent you. But in the photograph, we have got Martin on the right, and of course Ralph in the center. But that's Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. Reverend Fred is the Shuttlesworth is the Alabama human rights leader who really wanted and courted SCLC and Martin and Ralph and all of his colleagues to come to Birmingham to be leaders in the Birmingham movement. And so these are some of the victories of the Birmingham movement, which was the removal of white only and black only signs from restrooms and drinking fountains in downtown Birmingham, the desegregation of lunch counters, a city's own, by their own words, a Negro improvement plan, letting everybody out of jail. Some of the protesters had to spend time in the joint, and the creation of a biracial committee to monitor the agreement. Desegregation would take place slowly over the next few months, coupled with, unfortunately, violent attacks from segregationists, including the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the death of the 4 little girls. And we still remember all the martyrs of the movement. And it's different when we're talking about kids from, the leaders of the movement who enrolled in this crusade of sacrifice and commitment as King and his colleagues did, very different than these children who didn't choose to be born black or white, didn't choose to be born in Birmingham, Alabama, or Nashville, Tennessee, or where. And everything's happening so fast in this story. And the 13 years of King's career, we've collapsed into a semester, but it's all going on all at the same time. It's all happening so quickly. Meanwhile, Governor George Wallace is down in Tuscaloosa, where the Crimson Tide are, and the governor who said segregation now, segregation forever, the governor of Alabama went to the university and tried to block the door to prevent a black student from going to the University of Alabama. And today, best football team in all of college football is an integrated football team. This is not but a short time ago. You had the governor of Alabama, and look at him. Look at the look on his face. Straddled by these law enforcement officers trying to prevent a black student from going to class. A lot of what I'm going to share with you in the next little bit is from my reading of Parting the Waters, America in the King Years by Taylor Branch. And it's actually a trilogy of, thousands and thousands of pages of King's career. And really, it's a history of the civil rights movement through the lens of King. And I have to say, my whole approach to this class is inspired by so many other scholars, such as Professor Baldwin, my professor at Vanderbilt Divinity School when I took a King class myself. But I really am inspired by Taylor Branch and the way he tells this story. And he's a journalist. He's not telling it as a philosopher. He's not telling it as a theologian. He's just telling the story of everything that happened. And this is where we glean some of the behind the scene things that are going on. And we have to see that America is a myth. Class, work with me on this. America is a myth. And there's the public-facing myth of America and who we are. And then there's the undercurrent, and there's the backwash, and there's the untold stories that take place behind the scenes. And so for a moment of tonight's talk, I'm going to take us behind the scenes of what's going on during this period in 63, because I think some things really change and happen all at once that are really indicative of what we'll see in the years of the later King. And later King is considered to be post-Selma, and his emphasis on economic justice and on peace and nonviolence globally, as well as his resistance to the Vietnam War. Now we're going to leave some of this chronological King specific arc of the syllabus and go into little detours on women, Black power, and music and culture in the movement. And then we're going to come back around towards the end of the class, towards the springtime, and look at, the mountaintop speech and the Beyond Vietnam speech, and many of those other key later moments in later King. But it's often seen that later King was this, antagonist to America, whereas early King is seen as this patriot, as a believer even in American exceptionalism, the extraordinariness of our founding documents, and sort of this fusion that they really believed that they could take the gospel, New Testament, a story of Jesus and Paul and all that one of your classmates was talking about earlier, and kind of fuse that with the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And you could use that kind of pure democratic and Christian idealism to reform America, in kind of a way that would be lasting and sustainable. And so this idea that I think even as a King scholar, that Martin becomes a threat when he starts talking about social justice in terms of economics and redistribution of wealth and the poverty gap and things of this nature, and his anti-imperialism around an anti-war stance around the Vietnam War, that's what dubs him a radical. But King is already a radical, and the U.S. government already knows that, and King was not around. This is hard, y'all. Martin Luther King Jr. never lived under Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon becomes kind of a villain in the later days of the Vietnam War. And then, of course, there's Watergate and his resignation. But King only, from this point of his career on, is living, actually the last 8 years of his career, he lives under the administration of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, that the history books will tell you are these highly, highly sympathetic leaders to the civil rights movement. And public facing they are. And I don't want to diminish the success of their posture of solidarity with the civil rights movement. But behind the scenes, we are going to learn a painfully and dramatically different story that I think through the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover plants the demise of King long before Beyond Vietnam and long before the bullet at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. That speech that Kennedy gave, that was his big civil rights speech he gave in June of 1963. Right after that speech, Medgar Evers, a leader in Mississippi of the NAACP, a giant in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, was murdered right outside his house. His spouse and kids had to go outside and see his bleeding body lying in the dirt right outside of his home. Medgar is murdered right after Kennedy gives that speech. Kennedy gives that speech, and Medgar is murdered. That all happens like right at the same time on those 2 days of June 11 and 12 of 1963. This picture, I think I put it out of order in the slide, but this is very important here. So this on the right is President Kennedy. In the center is Roy Wilkins. And then look at King. King's giving, is King not giving Wilkins and Kennedy the side eye? So Roy Wilkins is the leader of the NAACP, and Mason, we spoke to this last week. There was a intense rivalry between the NAACP and SCLC, and I think that King and SCLC thought of themselves as being more cutting edge than NAACP. So notice how in your discussion of your paper earlier, you proposed that there is a cutting edgeness to Black Power, to Fred Hampton, to the Black Panther Party, out further out than King. I think King saw SCLC as being more out there than the NAACP, and that the NAACP's function was an inside lane. It was mainstream. It was the old guard. It was legal. It was lawsuits. It was politics. It was, it had a different posture, and SCLC was seen as an outlier. And I think that King was seen as this a little bit of a younger wild child, and so Wilkins and King had a rivalry. And even going up to the March on Washington, which I'll address in just a moment, they had to close ranks. So NAACP, SCLC, and then the other figure you saw in the film is A. Philip Randolph, who's an African-American labor leader. So they're bringing in the union movement. So you have the union movement, the NAACP, and the SCLC all uniting around this March on Washington as a prelude up to the Civil Rights Bill that they hope that John F. Kennedy is going to secure for them. In the behind the scenes, though, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship with Bobby and Robert Kennedy at this time was not a good relationship. This was not a smooth and soft relationship. And RFK and JFK, and I can't stress this enough, class, RFK and JFK would talk to Martin Luther King one way, and then they would turn around and they would talk to the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, another way. J. Edgar Hoover was like a government unto himself. J. Edgar Hoover, in some ways, felt as though domestically, as the head of our domestic secret police, could wield more power than the president and at this time, the Attorney General of the United States. Let me just say this again. There's a way in which you could look at this story as the president, John Kennedy, his Attorney General and brother, Robert Kennedy, wielding power, facing one way when they're talking to Roy Wilkins and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and then facing another way when they're dealing with their colleague, the head of the secret police, J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover is wanting to dictate practical working relationships for the president and the Attorney General in terms of how they deal with Martin Luther King Jr., because Hoover believed that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the greatest threat to the stability of the United States. Not the Vietnamese, not Malcolm X, not Black. The Black power is still emerging at this time. The Vietnam War is just getting going, but Hoover thought that Dr. King was the greatest danger to the United States going on at that time. And I mean, in concert with other things. And so they constructed this theory, and don't take Taylor Branch's word for it. Don't take Andrew Smith's word for it. Go and do, I hate saying do your own research. That's got such a weird tone anymore. But look at legitimate sources, historical sources on this topic, and because it's pretty confusing and pretty complicated. But what was actually going on at that moment is that Hoover was weaponizing and undermining the friendship between Reverend King and Stanley Levison. And Stanley Levison is a Jewish kind of liberal intellectual. He's got a legal background. He's smart. He helps King write his books. He makes contacts. He's one of King's advisors. When you're somebody as powerful and as committed to a nonviolent revolution in America as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, you're going to need to have some of your inner circle, people that you trust. Stanley Levison is somebody that MLK trusted and believed in. And through Hoover, using Bobby and Robert Kennedy, tried to convince Martin Luther King Jr. that Levison was an asset, an operative, an agent of the Soviet Union, that he was a communist plant, and that Levison was a top-ranking communist. And they tried to discredit the entire civil rights movement by sort of weaponizing the relationship between King and Stanley Levison. To his death, Levison denied that he was working for the Soviet Union. King did not believe Bobby or John Kennedy. And so King actually stood up to and kind of mouthed off to Kennedy, the Kennedy brothers, in defense of his friend Stanley Levison. But they went through a whole period where Martin and Stanley couldn't even talk to each other. They had to go through a middleman that they used, King's lawyer, Clarence Jones. They convinced King to fire an SCLC employee named Odell. King continued to have to distance himself from his dear, dear friend Bayard Rustin, because they claimed that Bayard Rustin was a communist. From my studies this week and from what I can glean, it is unclear if any of this was true, that if there was any real threat to the sanctity of the United States through these individuals, through the channels of King's movement and Levison's movement. And what becomes very, very transparent in reading the Branch biography is that JFK and RFK did not understand Black culture. They didn't try to understand Black culture. They would get Black leaders together. RFK is on record as having a problem with Black men being married to white women and thinking that represent them having some kind of a psychological problem. Basically, in plain layman's terms, what I'm trying to say to you is that the president and the attorney general were two-faced. And when push came to shove, Bobby Kennedy authorized the continuous surveillance and wiretapping of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. by the secret police of the United States. So Dr. King, who has a statue to him on the monument, who at one point in the early 60s was one of the most popular Americans. Now, his popularity descended greatly by the end of the 60s. He was very unpopular by his death. But in the 21st century, the majority of Americans have a favorable image of Dr. King. Something like 95% of Americans in the 21st century have had and I think it's probably gone. I bet it's gone down a little bit now. You go on YouTube and you find all kinds of horrible takedowns of Dr. King. But there was a period in the early 60s when his star was still rising, and there's a period in his post assassination fame, especially as we gained some distance on him, where now Dr. Cornel West calls it the Santa Clausification of Dr. King. But in any event, King's powerful, is a powerful figure in American history. Was seen as an enemy and possibly a communist, and his friends Bobby and John authorized him being spied upon for the rest of his life and the rest of his career, to the point where there would be memorandums that King would have to disseminate among the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to tell people to try not to do any business on the telephone. Don't trust using the telephone. The telephone is not a safe way to communicate. In the film next week, and I'm saying this now, I might forget it, I might say it again next week, they do not use any of King's actual words. When we watched the boycott documentary, when King spoke in the boycott, the character who's portraying Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in the boycott documentary, they used King's actual words. The King children forbade the filmmakers of Selma from using King's actual words, and so they had to paraphrase everything. And they did a great job. But when he's giving his speeches, and they're not giving the real speech, that is a flaw in the Selma film. And it was because the King children didn't like the expose of J. Edgar Hoover in the film and how it impacted the marriage of their parents, Coretta and Martin, and because it's not a pretty picture that Hoover tries to portray of the relationship. But they're bugging his room, they're following him everywhere for the rest of his life, and his buddy Bobby Kennedy, signed off on that, and that's hard. That's some hard medicine. And so King will always have a fraught relationship. They needed the federal government to enforce all these new laws in the segregationist South. And so history tends to believe that King was allied with the federal government, and the federal government was antagonistic to these renegade, segregationist, racist governments, local governments in the South. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But I also believe at the same time that there's a heart to RFK and JFK. I'm not trying to villainize them here at all. There's a heart to them where they really wanted to be sympathetic to King, and they probably were a little bit suspicious of Hoover even as they were doing his bidding, because Hoover's kind of a J. Edgar Hoover is something something. So I think they're taking some, there's some inner conflict, I think, in the Kennedy clan here in terms of their relationship with Martin. But mark my words for this, and this fits in with everything that Mason was saying earlier and what his paper is about and what we'll learn about Black Power. I think the Kennedys and then Lyndon Baines Johnson after them, they wanted to elevate and trust Martin because they were afraid of, if they didn't, that there might be a full-blown civil war over racial conflict, that there might be, I mean, I hate this phrase, a race war. That's such a terrifyingly problematic phrase, but that there might be greater civil, by the end of the 60s, there is going to be violent civil unrest coming from the protest movements. But I think it could have gotten more out of hand. And I think the success of Dr. King's nonviolent struggle, and that some victories were brought back to the oppressed communities and to the Black African American community in particular, gave King kind of gives the man an out. They preferred King to Malcolm. It's not, there's not a nice way to say it, but they are tarnishing King. They're tarnishing his advisors. And J. Edgar Hoover is not playing nice, and he is playing for keeps. So that's supposed to say the March on Detroit for Jobs and Freedom, before the March on Washington. The March on Detroit for Jobs and Freedom, the March on Detroit for Freedom comes in June, and the March on Washington comes in August. There was so much support. So that lots of Southerners, that includes white Southerners and Black Southerners, lots of white working class folks and Black working class folks migrated to Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit during the 50s and 60s, especially to work in Detroit in the automobile industry. So you had this huge burgeoning, Black community in Detroit, and a very famous minister called C.L. Franklin and his even more famous daughter, the great singer Aretha Franklin. Anybody know Respect? Well, King goes to Detroit for this epic march in June, and he actually does the rough draft of the I Have a Dream speech in Detroit 2 months earlier. The legend around the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, which he mentions briefly in our textbook, I think the way that he says it is he does reference the Detroit speech. I'm going to find the exact page number here really quick. That chapter is around 218 in our textbook. On page 223, he says, "I started out reading the speech and read it down to a point. The audience's response was wonderful that day, and all of a sudden this thing came to me. The previous June, following a peaceful assemblage of thousands of people through the streets of downtown Detroit, Michigan, I had delivered a speech in Cobo Hall in which I used the phrase, 'I have a dream.' I had used it many times before, and I just felt I wanted to use it here. I don't know why. I hadn't thought about it before the speech. I used that phrase, and at that point, I just turned aside from the manuscript altogether and didn't come back to it." So the last part of that famous speech was total freestyle, total off script. And it was him remembering the Detroit speech from a couple months before. And allegedly, Mahalia Jackson was on the platform party at DC saying, "Come on, Martin, tell him about the dream, Martin. Come on, Martin, tell him about the dream." So the March on Washington was integrated. It was a great outpouring of white support. It involves the Black labor movement, the NAACP, and SCLC. So there's a lot of unity and there's a lot of hope in the March on Washington, which I hope you guys caught in that one clip that we had from the March on Washington. And it is also beginning a period where, and it's going to happen again in Selma, where popular culture really starts coming out for Dr. King. So Harry Belafonte, Nina Simone, Mahalia Jackson, Aretha Franklin, all these, the Staples singers, all these great musicians are starting to come forward and be a part of, the movement. And here you see Joan Baez, the great white folk singer, and Odetta, a great Black folk singer, both singing at the March on Washington. And that famous image of Dr. King standing at overlooking the Great Washington Mall on that beautiful, beautiful summer day, thousands and thousands and thousands of people gathering. And then coming on the heels of that, sadly, the tragedy of the bombing at the church. And then, of course, it's just a couple months later after this, just right on the heels of that, is the president's trip to Texas. And this is not a class in the JFK assassination, but it's a very sad, it's a very, very, very sad year. And this is in a season where, there's many martyrdoms. When we get to Selma next week, there's going to be more martyrdoms. And so I think we have to, it's a sobering thing. And I think as we look at later on in the semester at the theology piece for your theology paper, just to really be thinking about what is it about humanity that our successes at becoming more loving, because King is somebody so profoundly motivated by love, that our attempts at becoming more loving are so fraught with violence and hatred, and that within the movement, these friendships are fraught with rivalry, that there's rivalries between all the different major organizations, SCLC, SNCC, NAACP, CORE. So you have all these different wings of the movement, and that doesn't even talk about the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party. So you have all these different wings of the movement. And there's a lot of jealousy and there's a lot of rivalry even within SCLC. And I'm so grateful that we spoke earlier about how important Ralph Abernathy is, but even in Martin and Ralph's friendship, there was jealousies and there was rivalries. And so I hope I've been able to give us a kind of a more comprehensive view of the summer of 1963. And that even as the dream is successful, and I think it is, the March on Washington is a victory, and it is a beautiful, beautiful time, there are setbacks happening all the time as well in the movement, including violence that is harming the movement. And while King's movement was largely nonviolent, the summer of '63 did see violence erupt in Birmingham and elsewhere. So that's going to wrap up this little portion of me talking here on King class. I can't believe it's class number 5. I'm really looking forward to getting in Selma next week, but there's so much footage for us to look at. I'm going to keep my part next week, I think, very, very brief. And I will probably speak mostly on next week about my father's trip to Selma in '65 and my trip to Selma with a group of Tennessee Tech students in 2015.